A book retells Genesis and the opening of Exodus, as if an angel on Sinai leaned close to Moses and unfolded the entire history of the world in a clean, unbroken timeline. A book claims the law did not begin at Sinai because it flowed from eternity, etched on heavenly tablets before the first sunrise. A book fixes the calendar at 364 days so that the festivals never drift, never slip, never bend to the moon. The Book of Jubilees steps into the story with that kind of audacity, and the response from later gatekeepers lands like a set of iron doors closing. Picture the ancient world that first heard this voice. Judea, in the 2nd century BCE, breathes the smoke of sacrifices, sings the psalms of ascent, and lives under the shadow of empires with marble teeth. Hellenistic fashions press into Jewish neighborhoods. Antiochus IV raises his banners. Priests argue over dates as if truth itself hangs on the sky. Into that storm, a Hebrew book appears and insists that creation itself runs on a sanctified calendar and a pre-written plan. The claim radiates power and provocation. Communities that controlled religious time would not yield it without a fight. This book lit that fuse and never apologized. Now hold that image of friction and add the most abrasive detail. Jubilees treats time like sacred architecture. 7 sevens define everything. 49-year cycles, the Jubilees frame history from Eden to Moses. Angels keep the Sabbath in heaven while the patriarchs keep it on earth long before Sinai. The author writes as though the Torah lived before the world began, a kind of bright thread woven into creation itself. Nothing new happens at Sinai in this telling. The mountain event becomes a grand reminder rather than a debut. That vision electrifies communities that longed for purity. It also undercuts any authority that claimed to evolve law through debate, adjustment, or cultural negotiation. The book's tone says the debate ended long before anyone opened their mouth. When a text carries that kind of certainty, authority figures either crown it or quarantine it. The history shows both moves. In Qumran, the community often called Essenes copied Jubilees eagerly. Fragments in Hebrew surfaced in Cave 1 and again in Cave 4 of the Dead Sea Discovery Catalog today as 4Q 216 through 4Q 224 proof that the book was not a late Christian fantasy or a medieval forgery. The community stored it alongside Isaiah, the community rule, and the war scroll. That placement signals loyalty without footnotes. And yet, centuries later, the book survives whole only in Ethiopic, carried by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church under the name Methafe Kufale, the Book of Divisions. A text with that trajectory did not simply go out of fashion. It met concerted resistance and an eventual shutdown in most circles that set the Bible's boundaries. The reason for the shutdown gathers around a number that seems harmless at first glance. 364. Jubilees swears by it. The author builds the calendar on 364 days, 52 perfect weeks. The result turns the festivals into fixed stars. Passover lands on the same weekday every year. Shavuot never wanders. Nothing ever drifts because the math stays locked. To the community that kept this calendar, time itself revealed God's order. To priests in Jerusalem, who managed a lunisolar system 354 days with periodic intercalation, this rival clock felt like a rival throne. Now track the implications. Jubilees 6 reads like a manifesto against lunar drift. It presents vows and warnings about keeping the appointed times according to the testimony of heaven. And it pronounces disaster on those who follow the moon into confusion. That language does not aim at pagans who worship moon gods. That language aims at fellow Israelites whose temple calendar follows lunar cycles. The book states that festival dates set in heaven should never budge, and that shifting them breaks the covenant rhythm. This is time as theology, not time as astronomy. Imagine Jerusalem when two calendars collide. One priest stands at the altar on one day, and declares celebration. Another community waits a day or two and calls that celebration profane. Sacred time fractures the city. The Essenes leave, historians say, precisely over disagreements like this, and they copy Jubilees like a constitution. In their caves, Passover begins when their 364-day grid announces it. In the city, smoke rises on a different day. The book's author knows what this looks like and writes with the energy of someone fighting for the soul of the calendar. The other provocation grows even bolder. Jubilees insists that the patriarchs obeyed the laws of Moses centuries before Moses. It narrates Abraham keeping festivals that the later Pentateuch only introduces at Sinai. It claims Jacob took tithes and kept vows that match later commands, as if the tablets already existed in heaven. The book says, angels of the presence and angels of sanctification keep the Sabbath, and that circumcision stands as an eternal sign, known above and below. The line about angels being created circumcised shocks modern readers, but it fits the author's logic. If the covenant law is written into the universe, then even heaven's servants reflect it. That mindset reveals why the book cannot bend to a negotiated calendar. The calendar is not a choice. It is creation's skeletal system. Law that pre-exists Sinai pushes hard against two later projects. Rabbinic Judaism, as it took shape after the temple's fall in 70 CE, framed the Torah with a robust oral tradition and a culture of disputation. Halakhic debates in the Mishnah and Talmud extend the written law into every corner of life. This culture thrives by development, argument, and case law. A book that repeatedly says the laws are fixed in heaven long before Moses, and even mapped onto the actions of angels, slices through that process with a cosmic blade. And early Christianity, built on the proclamation that the Messiah opened a new era for Jew and Gentile, hears in Jubilees an unyielding voice about permanent covenant markers like circumcision and dietary boundaries. The book's posture leaves little room for the kind of flexible inclusion that Christian missionaries proclaimed across the Mediterranean. A text that says the angels themselves live within these marks meets a very cold welcome from authors who teach that circumcision of the heart matters more than the cut of the flesh. The third rail of controversy hums in the book's demonology. Jubilees retells Genesis 6 with the weight of the Enoch tradition behind it. The watchers descend in the days of Jared. Giants fill the land. Violence multiplies. After the flood, not all evil disappears. Jubilees narrates Mastema, the chief of hostility, requesting a fraction of the unclean spirits so that they remain on earth to test and torment. 1/10, the text says, stays. That line addresses the persistent problem of evil lingering after the floodwaters recede. Noah, according to the book, learns remedies and writes them down. Herbs and prayers provide resistance. This is not the tidy morality of a children's story. This is cosmic realpolitik drawn into Israel's history. Later authorities handled that material with caution. Rabbinic tradition engages angel stories but keeps a careful leash. Church fathers battled dualistic systems and Gnostic speculations. Jubilees' blend of angelic law, demonic permissions, and heavenly tablets invites fascination and policing at the same time. The policing won outside Ethiopia. The book was bracketed as apocryphal or dangerous and, in practical terms, forbidden by the weight of custom and the scarcity of copies. That scarcity did not happen by accident. Scribes chose what to copy. Communities chose what to read aloud. Rabbis framed what defiles the hands, a technical phrase marking sacred scrolls. In those decisions, a book lives or dies. Early rabbinic sources warn against Sepharim Hitsenim external books, which includes a raft of writings that stand outside the emerging canon. Jubilees fit that category for sages who preferred the Pharisaic calendar and the Talmudic arc of law. Reading such texts on sacred days drew rebuke. Copying them fell off the to-do list. Over time, the classification hardens, and a practical ban forms without ever issuing a single imperial edict. The result feels like a velvet hammer. The book floats at the margins until it disappears from Jewish centers, even as it survives in the desert's vaults. In church history, the path looks similar. Early Christian authors knew a work called Little Genesis, a Greek title for Jubilees. A few kite it, many leave it aside. Lists of apocrypha develop, especially in the Latin West. A catalogue associated with the Decretum Gelasianum flags a Liber Jubilarum as not to be received among canonical writing. Whether every bishop repeated that title aloud in every region matters less than the effect that such lists created. The effect is oxygen deprivation. A text left off official reading lists does not travel, does not get copied, and ends up forgotten in regions where bishops and monasteries manage the shelves. Ethiopia tells the other story. The Ethiopic church canon embraces Jubilees fully. The book survives in Ge'ez, translated from Greek which had captured the earlier Hebrew. Manuscripts rest in monasteries that hang like eagles' nests in the highlands. Readers there call it Kufale, the divisions, because the precise parcels of time dominate its structure. The Ethiopian tradition keeps both Jubilees and First Enoch, the two great voices of the Enochic stream, and in doing so preserves a vision of sacred time and angelic order that the rest of the Christian world largely let go. The survival path cuts across deserts and mountains for a reason. Marginal landscapes often guard what central powers refuse to print. Return now to the book's internal features, because the content itself carries the why of its marginalization. Start with chronology. Jubilees divides history from creation to Sinai into exact sabbatical and jubilee cycles. Adam's years, Noah's years, Abraham's years all click into place as if history breathes with a 7-beat pulse. This is not an embellishment. This is the point. The author shows how heaven scripted the pace of redemption. That structure allows the book to press roots deep into Genesis, while promoting specific claims that matter in the 2nd century BCE. Strict Sabbath observance, prohibition of intermarriage with surrounding nations, and the eternal standing of circumcision. Those emphases answer immediate crises. Hellenistic culture lured many into mixed marriages and flexible lines. Syrian rulers promoted pagan sacrifices in the temple. Communities panicked and renewed zeal. The Maccabean revolt erupted out of that cauldron. Jubilees speaks in that urgency with a voice that anchors reforms in the fabric of creation. The way the book narrates the wives and family lines of the patriarchs underscores that insistence. It supplies names and genealogical connections for figures left nameless in Genesis, and it maps the boundaries of the land according to divine allotments given to the sons of Noah. The author curses transgression of borders as if moving a boundary stone, tears divine order. That energy plays into the political and religious stakes of the era. If God assigned lands to Shem, Ham, and Japheth, then Israel's inheritance stands set by oath, not by opportunity. A book that elevates those assignments turns social boundaries into sacred boundaries. Nothing about that fits a later Christian universal vision or a rabbinic project that adapts law to diaspora realities with pragmatic concessions. Calendar, genealogy, demonology, and eternal law converge into one challenge. This book pulls authority away from human institutions and claims it lives in the skies. The heavenly tablets motif repeats like a drumbeat. Commands, covenants, and dates exist above, then appear below. The effect becomes a double-edged sword. Communities like Qumran gain steel for their protest. Communities invested in priestly appointments and adaptive logic lose position. That loss provokes a quiet erasure. Readers later call it apocrypha and move on. The specifics of the 364-day calendar show why the tension felt so sharp. The math locks into 4 quarters of 91 days each. Each quarter begins on a Wednesday, the day Genesis says the luminaries were created. The year totals exactly 52 weeks. Festivals never slip a weekday. Shavuot lands on the 15th day of the third month in this scheme, always the first day after a full 7-week count from Passover. Always the same weekday. In a lunisolar scheme, intercalations interrupt that symmetry. Rabbis later wield a sophisticated lunar calendar with leap months inserted across a 19-year cycle to keep Passover in spring. Jubilees refuses that flexibility. It proclaims a cosmological harmony that makes every observance a rehearsal of creation's architecture. Temple authorities in a dynamic world heard in that refusal an implicit condemnation, which the book actually makes explicit. Those who observe the moon will go astray, it says, rehearsing the consequences without modesty. That line lands like a blow. Add to the calendar a fierce covenant theology. Circumcision stands forever. Dietary laws stand forever. Sabbath stands forever. The Jubilees author writes as if angels and patriarchs teach the same course in holiness, separated by a thin veil. That unity undermines the narrative of progressive revelation which some interpreters prefer, and it clashes with later Christian claims that the new covenant reshapes old practices. Paul's letters fight for a gospel to the nations without requiring circumcision. Jubilees treats circumcision as written into heaven. The collision becomes obvious and repeated. No formal counsel needed to say no. Practical use falls to zero in regions where Pauline theology governs. Jubilees also intensifies purity rules and intermarriage warnings. The book condemns marriages with Canaanites explicitly and builds stories around family lines to illustrate that point. Those details reflect the same concerns that animate Ezra-Nehemiah, where forced divorces and covenant renewal signal anxiety about identity. The Hasmonean dynasty that rose from the Maccabean revolt projected strictness but also carved a political path through the region. Some scholars read Jubilees as backing priestly ideals tied to Zadokite purity. Others see it as leaning into Hasmonean rhetoric while resisting their compromises. Either way, the book's alarm bells ring strongest in an age of cultural pressure. That intensity can feel like oxygen to separatist communities and like a threat to those who need coalition building, diplomacy, and broad tent leadership. There is another reason the book received the cold shoulder. It anchors authority in angelic intermediaries. The voice that instructs Moses in Jubilees often belongs to a high-ranking angel who reads from heavenly tablets. Moses becomes the recipient of a cosmic archives tour. This structure suits apocalyptic literature and the Enochic stream well. It does not suit later rabbinic insistence on Moses as the supreme prophet who delivers the Torah directly from God without angelic mediation. Nor does it suit certain Christian apologetic strategies that emphasized fulfillment of prophecy over ongoing angelic revelation. Theological shape matters in gatekeeping decisions. The more a book amplifies angels as authoritative mediators, the more gatekeepers worry about speculative cults and rival priesthoods. Jubilees does not promote cults. It does, however, promote a style of revelation that alarms rulemakers who prefer their chains of custody simple. Even small features in the text rubbed hard. The book lists celestial calendars, agricultural laws, and purity details with an air of unbending clarity. It accuses calendrical opponents of wrongdoing in terms that reshape fellowship into fault. Imagine community leaders trying to hold people together while explaining why observant neighbors choose a different day for sacred rites. Jubilees calls those neighbors transgressors of heavenly order. Leaders facing real politics in the city cannot absorb that sentence easily. Marginalization becomes a survival strategy for the center. Shelve the book. Discourage it openly or quietly. Move past it. Christian history adds another layer of aversion. The book's insistence on the law's permanence complicates arguments that Old Testament shadows give way to New Testament light. Church fathers accept moral continuity but argue for transformations in ritual obligations. Jubilees tolerates no such remodeling. Add to that a demonology that authorizes ongoing hostile spirits, and a narrative that foregrounds Israel's separations, and the book runs upstream against Christian universal preaching. Latin manuscripts that quote Jubilees in fragments continue for a while, then taper off. The Ethiopic tradition stands almost alone, carrying the text like a torch in the mountains, while the rest of the Mediterranean lines up its canon lists. Rediscovery turns the story again. In the 19th century, scholars acquired Ethiopic manuscripts and produced translations. R. H. Charles' early 20th century work brought the English-speaking world into contact with the text's full architecture, though dependent on a translation of a translation. Then the desert spoke. The Dead Sea Scrolls appeared in 1947, and among the fragments were Hebrew pieces of Jubilees. That set off a wave of re-evaluation. The book that had been tagged as fanciful or late suddenly stood with proven ancient roots. The Qumran cache showed the Hebrew original and confirmed the calendrical and halakhic system that shaped the Essenes' life. James C. Vanderkam and others dug into the text, publishing critical studies that mapped its influence across Second Temple Judaism. What had been apocrypha in the West became a key window into Jewish history in the pre-Christian centuries. The academics could not canonize it, but they could restore its voice to the conversation. Now lay the surviving fragments on the table, and notice the texture. Qumran copies emerge from Cave 4 with consistent recensions. The Ge'ez tradition shows signs of careful transmission through a Greek intermediary. Latin fragments echo Greek readings. This triangulation reveals a book with reach. It did not pop into existence in a far corner and vanish. It traveled through the major languages of the Eastern Mediterranean. That travel pattern demands a reason for the later disappearance. The ban, in practice, lands as non-use. Condemnation enlists, and the slow drift of institutional disapproval. Communities that broke bread weekly without this book did so by choice, and their choices hardened into common sense. Then the desert flipped the script by showing early Jewish communities building their life around it. The idea that Jubilees was formally banned invites correction. No ecumenical council pronounced a universal curse upon it. No single Jewish court issued a statute naming it. Instead, the book suffered a drawn-out soft ban. Rabbis warned against external books. Church lists shamed apocrypha. Scribes picked their projects based on the needs of their patrons and the rules of their houses. Put those choices together for generations, and a book vanishes. The effect is indistinguishable from a ban because the result is the same. A text cannot shape ordinary readers if it cannot be found on any shelf. The gravity that pulled it off the shelf remains as clear as the day it was written. In a world of shifting empires, competing calendars, and contested priesthoods, Jubilees offered cosmological certainty. A 364-day year promised stability. Heavenly tablets promised permanence. Angels promised immediacy. A fiery ethic of separation promised identity that state pressure could not erase. Those promises stabilized Qumran's life and helped break a city's unity. Later centers, seeking minimum friction and maximum control, called it outside. Ethiopian Christians, comfortable with a wider canon and formed in a different geopolitical saddle, kept it inside and reading. Zoom in on a few of the book's scenes that most stubbornly refused assimilation. In Jubilees 6, after the flood, Noah renews covenant observances and establishes festivals in rhythm with a solar year. The text anchors Shavuot, Feast of Weeks, as a perpetual covenant sign that predates Sinai, tied to oaths sworn by the patriarchs. That move reclassifies a later Mosaic festival into an ancient cosmic memorial. Communities that grant such antiquity to Shavuot cannot easily accept a different festival date sanctioned by temple officials who follow a different calendar. The rift becomes more than arithmetic. It becomes loyalty to heaven's signatures. In Jubilees 15, The everlasting covenant of circumcision appears as a boundary that angels themselves honor by nature. The author states without hesitation that this command stands beyond time. The rhetorical strategy is straightforward and relentless. Anything true of heaven must remain true of God's people, unbent by cultural change. That strategy kneecaps any attempt to relativize a command under new circumstances. Christian preachers who argued that circumcision did not bind Gentile converts heard in this text the very voice they worked against. The unity of creation and law that Jubilees announces made little room for their pastoral projects. Jubilees also retells the early Genesis stories with an eye toward ethnography. The divisions of the earth among Noah's sons appear with named boundaries, from the Nile to Euphrates to distant maritime territories labeled Kittim and beyond. The text declares that anyone who violates these chartered allotments commits a great sin. A writer in the Hellenistic period, living through population movements, imperial colonization, and contested borders, uses those ancient assignments as a theological argument against imperial rearrangements. That rhetoric is powerful and dangerous. It equips marginalized groups with a cosmic map. It also collides with empires and later universalist religions that decide identity by faith rather than land. Another knot to pull involves the Watchers. The Enochic strand that flows into Jubilees presents the Watchers' descent as the origin of a specific set of evils: bloodshed, sorcery, sexual sin, and forbidden knowledge. Jubilees compresses and refocuses that material, pushing it into the larger chronology of Jubilees. Evil does not vanish after one judgment. It lingers because God allows a remnant of hostile spirits to remain for testing. This theological assertion supports the reality of ongoing spiritual conflict without slipping into cosmic dualism. Yet that middle path still troubled later authorities who fought antinomian or Gnostic currents that used angelic lore to build rival mythologies. Safer to reduce angel narratives or reframe them than to read widely from a text that majors on them. Within Judaism, the decisive currents flow through the wreckage of 70 CE and the rebuilding of religious life without a temple. The center shifts from priestly altars to rabbinic benches. In that reconstruction, a tradition that privileges canonical Torah, prophets, and writings, while increasingly warning against outside books, takes hold. Works like Sirach circulate in Greek and Hebrew, yet receive side-eye. Enoch and Jubilees cluster as outliers loved by some, suspect to others. By the time the Mishnah solidifies and later Talmud discussions methodize law, the Enochic library does not function in the main line. A practical purge unfolds. Liturgical life consolidates around texts that defile the hands, the technical mark of scriptural sanctity. Jubilees loses that argument in the rabbinic sphere, even if some of its ideas echo in midrashic and mystical hints. Within Christianity, the path compresses around apostolic writings and the Septuagint's main catalog. The Orthodox East and Latin West each cultivate lists of books and draw lines around edifying but non-canonical texts. Jubilees, already absent from Greek-speaking mainstreams aside from a handful of references, enters the Latin world in fragments and then recedes. The lists that mark off Apocrypha tighten the circle. The absence becomes official by habit, if not by thunderbolt. Ethiopian Christianity, with its own apostolic heritage and a different canon history, retains a broader library without apology. That divergence illustrates how canonization reflects ecclesial geography as much as theology. The rediscovery in the 20th century rebalanced the scholarly debate, not by canonizing the book, but by confirming its standing as a cornerstone of the Second Temple period. Scholars now use it to map the intellectual terrain that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, to understand debates about calendar and law that stand behind the Gospels and Paul's letters, and to reconstruct Jewish memory about the patriarchs. Jubilees shows the world as the Essenes understood it. That understanding includes relentless holiness, precise timekeeping, cosmic law, and realities of spiritual opposition. Those elements clarify why John the Baptist appears in the Gospels with an Essene flavor, and why early Christian texts sometimes echo solar calendar debates without naming them. The label banned holds if defined by effect rather than decree. The centers of Jewish and Christian power pressed this book to the margins because it challenged their timekeeping, their theological flexibility, and their institutional authority. The merits of those centers' decisions belong to another debate. Their influence on the book's survival sits in plain view. Qumran preserved, Ethiopia preserved, the mainstream shelved it. When hewn caves and highland monasteries become the last guardians, the word forbidden lands with contour. For readers today, the shock comes in realizing how much a book outside most Bibles shaped the air the Bible breathes. The calendar fights frame the crucifixion and resurrection narratives, the festival settings, and the disputes that drove Jesus into conflict. The idea of heavenly books and pre-existent law hums in late prophetic literature and in New Testament echoes about names written in heaven. The Watchers loom behind the New Testament's brief lines about angels in prison and spirits of disobedience. An apocryphal book did not insert those ideas into Scripture. It displays the ecosystem that produced them. That display felt like a threat to later gatekeepers determined to draw sharper lines and simpler connections. Jubilees remains stubbornly itself. It refuses to apologize for its confidence. The text lays out the world in clean grids of sevens, crowns the Sabbath as a cosmic drumbeat, consecrates Israel's identity as a permanent sign, and reads the patriarchs as if they already wore the covenant like a garment. It explains lingering evil, insists that Noah knew remedies, and warns that the moon's seductions lead to impiety. The author believed that time itself bore witness against compromise. Communities that needed compromise reached for quieter books. The survival of Jubilees in Ethiopia carries another layer of testimony. It shows that different Christian histories create different canons and different spiritual imaginations. In the Ethiopian church, where the year still turns with unique rhythms and ancient feasts, reading Jubilees fits like a key in a lock. The book's insistence on sacred time and angelic ministry resonates in a liturgy crowded with angelic references and a calendar rich with fixed commemorations. The West, shaped by other debates and under other political pressures, found in Jubilees a destabilizer and slid it off the desk. The caves and the highlands now speak together. The fragments from Qumran and the complete Ge'ez manuscripts shake hands across continents and centuries. The handshake confirms that the book once stood near the center of a powerful Jewish movement, and that official streams later eased it off stage. That easing created space for other projects, and it created amnesia about a crucial slice of Jewish thought. The modern reader now holds the power to put it back into view without collapsing canon boundaries. The act of reading does not recanonize. It illuminates. The starkness of Jubilees does not need augmentation. It creates its own drama with numbered days and heavenly records. Every page announces a contest between eternal constancy and historical flexibility. The winners of that contest in one age write the reading lists for the next. The losers hide their treasures in caves. Centuries later, hands covered in dust bring those treasures back to daylight, and the logic of the ancient ban becomes clear in the revealed artifact. The reason reads plainly. The book refused to let humans own sacred time. Those who lived by owning sacred time needed it gone. The chronology of resistance and preservation stretches long. Early Jewish circles wrote it in Hebrew during the Hasmonean generation or just before, an era vibrating with calendar disputes, identity crises, and priestly turmoil. And Greek translations moved it into wider diaspora circulation, which then fed a Latin stream. Rabbinic reforms narrowed the reading pool after the temple's fall. Church lists bolted the canon door in the West. Ethiopic manuscripts nested it safely. European scholars rediscovered and translated The Dead Sea Caves vindicated the text's antiquity and centrality for an influential sect. Every turn reinforces the book's status as both cornerstone and contraband, depending on the neighborhood. Reading it now produces effects that echo its first uses. The calendar still mesmerizes. The theological posture still bristles. The angelic world still feels closer in its pages than in canonical narratives. The voice that calls Shavuot eternal still rises like a trumpet. The conviction that boundary stones belong to heaven's cartography still sounds like a manifesto penned under pressure. The book remains transparent about its agenda. Restore cosmic order through strict observance and exact timekeeping. Communities that share that agenda embrace it. Communities that prefer adaptive elasticity resist it. The modern world, split between longing for order and need for flexibility, hears both siren songs at once. The sober conclusion lands with the weight of a carved tablet. The Book of Jubilees was not simply lost. It was set aside by communities that needed calendars they could control, by gatekeepers who trimmed angelic mediation from Revelation's chain of custody, and by theologians who sought a way to include the nations without placing eternity's stamp on a specific ritual sign. That setting aside worked so well that entire civilizations forgot the book's name, except as a shadow. Then a cave opened its mouth, and an Ethiopian monastery opened its chest, and the shadow regained a face. The logic of the ban unveils the core of the book's power. By fixing time, the book asserts that identity stands secure. By placing law in heaven, it asserts that no assembly has authority to override it. By naming demons and setting limits on their presence, it asserts that evil persists only within ordained boundaries. Each assertion liberates a beleaguered community and cramps a managerial one. The keepers of centralized religion do not often favor texts that reduce their discretionary space. The story writes itself from there, not in edicts but in habits and lists, in what gets copied and what gets left to the scorpions and salt. The scroll returns to the table, steady and unapologetic. It narrates Eden, the flood, Abraham, and Sinai, with a rhythm that honors 7 above all. It holds a heavenly pen to earthly dates. It tells Israel to draw lines, not to prove superiority, but to honor a design built into creation. It calls festivals rehearsals of cosmic events, not local parties. It speaks with the earnestness of a priest and the precision of an astronomer. It attracts readers who fear drift and repels institutions that depend on adjustment. That polarity explains its history better than any single decree. Reach the end, and the pattern clarifies. The book was effectively banned because it refused to let the powerful move the feast days, loosen the covenant signs, or silence angels in the courtroom of Revelation. It was embraced where resistance required steel. It was jailed where unity required concessions. It survived in places where the mountains keep secrets and the desert keeps faith. It returns now, not as a new law, but as a recovered witness to a fierce and beautiful thread in Israel's story.